In the history of warfare, the front line was always a place you traveled to. It was a trench, a ridge, or a beachhead. But in 1939, the world changed. The front line didn't just move, it rose. It climbed into the clouds and looked down on the very concept of home. Welcome back to The Chosen Few. Usually, we're down in the dirt, analyzing the casualty rates of specific battles and the tactical maneuvers of infantry. But today, we're looking at a different kind of math. We're looking at the tonnage of steel dropped on civilian centers, the systematic erasure of city skylines, and the millions of lives upended by a war that came from the sky. We're going to look at 5 nations that bore the brunt of this aerial onslaught. We'll look at the loss of life, but also the loss of the walls and roofs that kept people safe. We're talking about housing loss rates that turned entire populations into refugees in their own backyards. And let's be honest, when your home is gone, even the basics like a warm meal or a humble potato feel like a luxury you can't afford. Before we break this down into our 3 segments, the European theater, the Pacific Front, and the global aftermath, I want to hear from you. Look at the data points you already know. Which country do you think suffered the most? Was it the relentless, multi-year strategic bombing of Germany? The devastatingly efficient firebombing of Japan? Or perhaps the long, often overlooked terror rained down on China? Pause the video, head to the comments, and cast your vote. Let's see if the raw numbers change your mind by the end of this episode. This is the cost of total war. This is the air war of 1939 to 1945. Let's dive into segment 1. To understand why the casualty and housing loss rates in Europe reached such staggering heights, we have to look at a grim military theory known as dehousing. In the early 1940s, military planners realized that if you couldn't effectively hit a tiny factory from 20,000 feet, you could instead destroy the homes of the people who worked there. If a worker has no roof over their head and no bed to sleep in, they can't make tanks. It was a cold, mathematical approach to total war that turned the civilian living room into a legitimate military target. The aerial war in the West began in earnest with the Blitz. From September 1940 to May 1941, the German Luftwaffe pounded British cities, primarily London. While the death toll, roughly 60,000 civilians, is lower than the numbers we see later in the war, the housing statistics tell a much more chaotic story. The UK didn't just lose buildings, it lost its sense of domestic security. Out of a total housing stock of about 13 million, 3.7 million British homes were damaged or destroyed by German bombs. That is nearly 30% of the entire nation's housing. While only about 222,000 of those were totally leveled, the sheer volume of affected homes created a logistical nightmare. Imagine 1 in 3 families living with boarded-up windows, leaking roofs, or collapsed walls. This widespread, minor, damage was a psychological grind. Life became a struggle for the basics: warmth, water, and food. When the grocery stores were leveled, the British people turned to victory gardens. If the Blitz was a hammer, the Allied response was a wrecking ball. By 1942, the RAF and the USOF began a strategic bombing campaign of a scale the world had never seen. They weren't just hitting London-sized targets, they were systematically erasing the urban centers of the Third Reich. The numbers in Germany are where the math of war becomes truly terrifying. Tonnage. The Allies dropped nearly 1.9 million tons of explosives on Germany. For context, that is roughly 25 times the weight of explosives dropped on the UK. The death toll: between 350,000 and 500,000 civilians were killed. The variation in the data often comes from the chaos of the final months of the war, where refugees from the east were caught in Western bombings. The housing crisis. This is where the destruction becomes almost incomprehensible. By 1945, 1.87 million German dwellings were completely destroyed. In large cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden, the housing loss rate wasn't 20% or 30%. It was often over 50%. In the center of many German cities, the destruction was 100%. We cannot talk about the casualty rates in Europe without mentioning the firestorm. During raids like Operation Gomorrah in Hamburg, 1943, the density of incendiary bombs created a chimney effect. The air in the city became so hot that it rose rapidly, sucking in fresh oxygen from the surrounding areas at hurricane-force speeds. In these moments, the housing wasn't just hit, it was incinerated. People in basement shelters didn't die from the blast. They died from carbon monoxide poisoning as the fire above sucked the oxygen out of their lungs. In a single night in Hamburg, more people died than in the entire 6-month bombing of London. The comparison. When we look at the casualty rates of these two nations, we see a divergence. The UK suffered a wide but shallow level of destruction. Millions of homes damaged, but fewer total deaths. Germany suffered a concentrated and deep level of destruction. Fewer homes damaged, because they were simply deleted from the map, leading to a death toll nearly 8 times higher than Britain's. By 1945, the European landscape was a graveyard of brick and mortar. But as the smoke cleared in the west, a new and even more intense chapter was being written in the east. In Europe, the air war was a battle of brick, stone, and mortar. But as we turn our eyes to the Pacific theater, the nature of the destruction changes entirely. Here, the math of war met a different kind of architecture, wood, paper, and bamboo, and the result was a casualty rate that dwarfs almost anything seen in the West. Before a single bomb fell on London or Berlin, the people of China were already living under a sky filled with Japanese bombers. Starting as early as 1931 and intensifying after 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service began a campaign that lacked the industrial pretense of Western strategic bombing. This was terror bombing in its purest form. The city of Chongqing became the most bombed place on Earth for a time, enduring over 5,000 individual air raids. Because China lacked a modern air force or sophisticated radar, the civilian population was largely defenseless. Casualties. Estimates range from 260,000 to over 350,000 civilians killed by air raids. Housing loss. In Chongqing alone, nearly 30,000 buildings were leveled. Because many Chinese homes were densely packed and made of flammable materials, a single hit often turned into a neighborhood-wide blaze. Life in these cities became a subterranean existence. People lived in caves and tunnels for years. For the chosen few surviving in these conditions, food was the ultimate currency. While we might joke about russets' love for a good potato, in war-torn China, a simple tuber was often the only thing standing between a family and starvation when the markets were nothing but craters. If the bombing of China was a long, slow burn, the bombing of Japan was a sudden, blinding flash. For the first few years of the war, Japan was largely out of reach for Allied bombers. That changed in 1944 with the introduction of the B-29 Superfortress. General Curtis LeMay, the commander of the US strategic bombing effort, made a radical and controversial tactical shift. He realized that high-altitude precision bombing wasn't working due to the jet stream winds over Japan. His solution? Low-altitude night firebombing. The target wasn't just factories, it was the shadow factories. The thousands of tiny home-based workshops where Japanese families assembled engine parts. To destroy the industry, LeMay decided to destroy the neighborhoods. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, the US launched Operation Meeting House. Over 300 B-29s dropped 1,600 tons of napalm-filled incendiaries on Tokyo. The death toll. In just 6 hours, an estimated 100,000 people died. To put that in perspective, that is more immediate deaths than the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. The physical toll. 16 square miles of the city were burned to the ground. Over 1 million people were left homeless in a single night. The housing loss black hole. By the end of the war, the statistics for Japan were staggering. While Germany saw roughly 20% of its housing destroyed over 5 years, Japan lost a similar percentage in just 8 months. National destruction. Approximately 2.2 to 2.5 million homes were destroyed across the country. Urban erasure. In many Japanese cities, the destruction rate reached 60% to 70%. By the time the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were few target cities left in Japan that hadn't already been scorched. The housing loss in Japan created a unique post-war crisis. Millions of people were living in shanty towns made of corrugated iron salvaged from the ruins. The casualty rates we discuss on this channel aren't just numbers on a page. They represent the total collapse of the domestic environment, the atomic culmination. We cannot discuss the Pacific without the atomic bombings. Hiroshima lost nearly 70% of its buildings instantly, and Nagasaki lost about 40% due to its hilly terrain shielding some neighborhoods. But even without the split atom, the conventional firebombing campaign had already effectively dehoused the Japanese Empire. When we compare the two theaters, the Pacific was deadlier per ton of bombs dropped. The combination of wooden architecture and incendiary technology created a kill rate that turned the sky into a literal furnace. The smoke finally cleared in August 1945, but for the millions of survivors across Europe and Asia, the war didn't end with a signature on a battleship. For those whose homes had been deleted from the map, a new struggle began. The battle against exposure, hunger, and displacement. The Great Displacement. By the end of the war, the world faced a housing deficit that is almost impossible to wrap our heads around today. In Germany alone, 11.5 million people were homeless or lived in severely damaged buildings. In Japan, that number was closer to 9 million. These weren't just refugees, in the sense of people crossing borders. These were internally displaced persons living in the ruins of their own streets. In the bombed-out basements of Berlin and the scorched earth of Tokyo, people lived like urban cave dwellers. Survival depended on the most basic of resources. In these ruins, the luxury of a cookie was a distant memory. If you could find a potato in the blackened soil of a backyard garden, you had a feast. How do you rebuild a continent? In Germany, the task fell largely to the Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women. With most of the working-age men dead, or in POW camps, these women formed human chains, passing charred bricks one by one, cleaning them, and stacking them to be used again. It was a manual, agonizing process of recycling a civilization. In the UK, the government turned to industrial mass production. They created the prefabs, temporary, factory-built homes that could be bolted together in days. Originally meant to last only 10 years, some of these temporary solutions were so beloved, or the housing crisis was so persistent, that people were still living in them decades later. Japan's reconstruction was even more radical. Because so much of their urban core had been incinerated, they didn't just rebuild, they redesigned. The firebombing of 1945 led to the modern, concrete and steel, fireproof cities of Japan we see today. The price of that modernization, however, was the total erasure of their architectural history. Now, we return to the question we asked at the start of the episode. When we look at the casualty rates and the housing loss, who truly suffered the most from the air war? By tonnage and duration, Germany takes the top spot. They endured the most sustained, multi-year pounding in human history. Over 1.8 million homes were lost over 60 months of relentless pressure. By intensity and efficiency, Japan stands alone. The US destroyed more homes in Japan in 8 months than they did in Germany in 5 years. The firebombing campaign was the most efficient destruction of human life ever recorded, culminating in the atomic age. By resilience and terror, China suffered the longest. They were bombed for nearly 14 years, with almost no way to fight back. Their casualty rates reflect a civilian population that was targeted not for their factories, but for their morale. The verdict of the chosen few. If we look at the housing loss rate as our primary metric for civilian suffering, the answer is a grim tie between Germany and Japan. Both nations saw their urban centers effectively deleted, with nearly 20 to 25% of their national housing stock turned to ash. However, if we look at affected population, the UK is a staggering contender. While their death toll was lower, the fact that 1 in 3 homes was damaged meant that the air war touched the lives of nearly every single British citizen. The air war of World War II proved one thing. You can destroy a building, but it is much harder to destroy the will of the people inside it. The casualty rates tell us how many died, but the housing statistics tell us how many had to start from zero. So, did the data change your mind? Did you expect the housing loss in Japan to be so much higher than in the UK? Or were you surprised by the sheer tonnage dropped on Germany? Let us know in the comments if you've changed your vote. And if you want to see us break down the casualty rates of the Eastern Front, where the war was fought house to house instead of cloud to house, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. As we do every episode, I invite you to join us in a moment of reflection. This has been The Chosen Few. Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't just about who won, it's about what it cost to get there. We'll see you for the next one.